How do you become the founder of a dynasty that lasts for centuries? What are the concrete steps you can take to ensure a great life not just for you, but for your children, your grandchildren, and dozens of future generations? To answer these questions, I had to go to someone with first-hand experience in the matter. That's why I invited His Imperial and Royal Highness Archduke Eduard of Austria to join me for a conversation. Archduke Edward is a member of the House of Habsburg, one of the most important and prominent families in the entire history of Europe. The family can trace its roots back to the 11th century, and for nearly a millennium, they reigned over vast portions of Europe, including the Holy Roman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and even Spain and its New World possessions during the Spanish Golden Age. Edward is the author of the Habsburg Way, a phenomenal book that pulls from the rich history of his family to share insight into 7 key principles at the heart of Habsburg thought, action, politics, and family life. In this conversation, we go in-depth into each of these principles so that you can learn from the best of Habsburg wisdom and start a dynasty of your own. This really was an incredible interview, and I learned so much both from reading Edward's book and from spending time with him in person. Enjoy the conversation, and I hope you find it just as inspiring as I did. Edward Habsburg, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Look, I am thrilled to have you on. I truly am. You have written a phenomenal book. And this book is not just a great love story to your family, as you so put it in the intro, but it's also a really inspiring and encouraging piece of literature. I was reading it, obviously learning stories about your family, but what I was impressed by is your ability to tie all of this back to the present, to real principles of how people can live. And I think that your work, arguably more than any other, that I've discussed on this show, is very concrete in terms of trying to do exactly what we're trying to do, of trying to give people actionable principles for living. So
Yes.
Today, what I'd love to discuss with you is, how does one live like a Habsburg? What can we learn from your family, and what can their lessons teach us about living better today?
Gladly. That was the idea of the book. The idea was not just to rattle down a few facts about the family or to speak about the members. The idea was to give people something to take home, like after a good sermon, where you take something home into your week and says, I could try that too.
Exactly. So you have 7 main rules in this book, 7 main rules or maxims of life like a Habsburg.
Yes.
And the first one, I think we could just go one by one through these. The first one is get married. All right, maybe what we'll have you do is kind of explain a little bit of the reasoning behind each point, of course, how that can be applied to each life. But also, I'd be curious to know with this one in particular, why did you start the book with this? Why did you start with get married?
Well, I would say there are several reasons why I started with that point. The first is I am married and I have lots of children. So it sort of sprang to mind immediately. Also, if you think of the Habsburg family, most people know they had lots of children. We like to joke that Habsburg is a plural word. There is not one Habsburg. There's always several. And of course, the Habsburgs are famous for their marriage politics. They're famous for doing politics through marrying off their children. So that springs to mind immediately. Also, not all of my readers are Catholic. So, of course, my other possibility would have been to begin with the Habsburgs being Catholic and therefore be Catholic, the second rule. But I thought not everybody is Catholic, so I'd rather begin with a marriage part. And I really could imbue that with 28 years of experience of being married. And of course, having seen the marriage of my parents and looking around me, I saw that people are not getting married and they don't have many children. In fact, I'm ambassador for a country, Hungary, that tries to encourage people to get married and to have lots of children. And yes, I think a central thing is it makes you happy. It makes both spouses happy to have lots of children. But it's also good for the state you live in. A family with many children is a place where you learn all the virtues that you need to make a happy and good society. That's what you learn at home around the dinner table. And so all of that was in my mind when I began to write about how my family saw marriage. And no, it's a good chapter, and so yes, some people have prejudice. I address them a bit later in the book.
Good. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the virtue of getting married. So you've mentioned this as the first rule, get married. And one of the really beautiful points that you put that was eye-opening to me, because it made me kind of see this in a different perspective, was you mentioned how when you are married and you show the obvious love and respect between spouses, when children grow up with that, that shows them that life is actually worth living. Because I think there's something deep down, and I'll let you elaborate on this a little bit more, but there's something deep down that makes us say, a successful life is one in which we can love and be loved. And when you don't have that as an example growing up as a child, perhaps you grow a little bit cynical, and understandably, because you say, is this ever even possible? But one of the best things you can do is to actually live that out and show by firsthand experience that yes, this life is worth living. There's good that can come from it.
If you grow up in a family where both parents love each other, respect each other, you learn to trust reality. You believe that it's worthwhile living. You learn about beauty. You learn about virtue. You learn about following your dreams. All these things you learn if you have a couple that loves each other and respects each other. And you can't fake it. Children know. My father always used to say, children, they don't watch what you're saying, they watch what you're doing. They know exactly. So they know exactly whether you really love each other as a couple and try to be faithful and honest and good with each other. All of this builds like brick on brick on brick on brick, a very solid foundation. And when you go out into the world, you're ready to confront the world in a positive way, and you're ready to build a good society. All of that comes out of a marriage. But we live in a world where we're being encouraged to be selfish. We're being encouraged to have changing partners all the time. Never, as somebody once said very cynically, don't get into anything you can't walk away from in 5 minutes. It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. And the great thing about a great marriage, and I was happy enough to experience that at home, it encouraged me to go out there and risk my life on another marriage, and it became a great marriage.
Yeah, I love that. One of the really practical benefits, if we're talking about, all right, why get married? Because you start the book this way and you're trying to teach people, all right, if you want to live like a Habsburg, here's what you got to do. And get married is the premise of that. And part of this is because, as you mentioned, the marriage politics and how the Habsburgs, there's this saying in Latin, as you so well put, the others, they make war. You, Austria, you get married. Yes. That's how you grow your empire.
Yes.
And what's so interesting about that is we're seeing it in this long-standing Habsburg context. But what we also see it practically in the day-to-day if we really take a moment to think about this. So what I mean is one of the biggest sources of financial impoverishment of families today is divorce. When you get divorced, the family wealth separates, thus destroying to a degree generational wealth. A ton of it goes to the lawyers, to the taxes, to all this stuff. It just dissipates. And so the actual essence of being to pass down something to another generation, that starts to go out the door.
Yes.
Not to mention, of course, the benefits that one has from actually growing up in a stable family. Yes. I think there's more and more studies of this every day, essentially, about how the best benefit, the best privilege or step up on the competition that you can give to your child is to be raised. Because if you grow up in a single household, you're more likely to commit crime of some sort. You're more likely to be behind in school, to have emotional, physical health issues. We see all this play out. And so with the Habsburgs building a dynasty and so much of it happening through marriage, this was so great to hear you put, because it's essentially showing that if someone listening to this, if they want to be the patriarch of their family, they want to be the one who starts a generation, a new dynasty, that getting married and staying married is the best way. It's not just the best way, it's the foundational way. You start the book with this, and I think appropriately so.
Absolutely. This is one of the questions I got quite often is like, if I want to found a dynasty like the Habsburgs, I say, you can begin tomorrow. You get married, you have children, you pass on your your family values, the things you believe in, you pass them on to the next generation and see them multiply, see them being passed down. Archduke John, who lived around 1790, 1800s, he got married. He only had 2 children, but then 2 generations on, they had lots of children, and nowadays his family is meeting his descendants from his branch of the family, the Meran family. They meet every few years and make a pilgrimage together. There is hundreds, if not thousands. So you can begin now. You can begin now, and I believe that for many people this is a big step. We live in a society that doesn't encourage us, but that's why I wrote this book. I say, go for it. And many people think this is a provocation to say, get married and have lots of children. It's a provocation, but it's a provocation that wants to encourage people to do something that will be good for them, that will make them happy. Both of them, society, the children, all of them.
Well, one piece of advice that people have probably heard is, if you're going through a tough time, try to think of yourself as the hero of a movie. The camera's on you. What would the hero do at this moment? And that, being able to conceive of yourself from a third-party perspective, it does help.
Yes.
But in the same way, what I love about your book is you're able to say, what would the founder of a dynasty do?
Yes.
And I think there is a degree to which people need to mythologize their life in a sense.
Yes.
And actually one of your ancestors did this literally with the, I believe it's the Privilegium Maius.
Yes.
Coming up with, hey, Julius Caesar told, our descendant
Well, he
here.
didn't come up with it, he found the letter.
He found the letter.
He found the letter in a clumsy Latin, but it was obviously by Julius Caesar.
Obviously written by Julius Caesar.
So
and this was...
I really said, if it helps, make up your own mythology, if it's good, of course, and then pass it on. You have to find out what are the things that inspire me, and if part of your mythology is my children have to know the Lord of the Rings, then this is part of your family mythology. But stick to it. So yeah, absolutely, you can be creative in creating a myth for your dynasty.
Well, one point before we move off of, get married and have lots of children, is the children itself. You made one great observation, which is that children growing up with siblings, this is where they first learn the virtues in society. It's not that they go to school and learn them, it's that they grow up living them and experimenting them, in person. So if the younger child at the table is being spoken over, well, you have to learn how to actually have a conversation, how to make room for others. Tell me a little bit more about this.
Pope Francis sometimes speaks about the family around the dinner table, and I thought about that, and I said this is one of the points where I marvel. You get married, you have children, and suddenly you have 6 children, and then when you sit around the table and all of them speak at the same time very loudly. I have 5 girls and 1 boy, so this happens. It happens, and you realize what have we done? What have we started? But then you watch the dynamics around the dinner table. So first of all, we have the rule in our house. The youngest child always gets first to eat. Which, the elder ones are sometimes grumpy and hungry, but they learn that the weakest member in the table gets served first. And that you cannot speak over one of your younger siblings. You do this twice, the sibling will run out screaming and crying, and then you have to bring her back. And you have to make her accept it. You learn that, oh wow, I'm not the center of the universe. The only meaning of the universe is not me. There is others. You have to share things. There is not always enough food. There's not as much as you would like to because there's more people around the table. So all of those virtues, looking after others, taking care of others, also being careful not to frighten younger siblings, and younger siblings learning from the big ones. Without the parents always being the ones, you learn from the entire community. All of this happens around the table. I don't know how somebody who grows up alone can get these experiences. In an ideal family, it's sometimes possible that a family can only have 1 child. And God will provide. You will be able to pass on virtues. But it's so much easier if you have apart from the fact that if you have 1 or 2 children, you can cheat yourself into thinking that you're still a student family you can have 1 child on 1 arm, you can have a 2nd child on the 2nd arm, but the 3rd child you can't hold. So from the third, well, my rule is always, before you don't have 3 children, family hasn't really begun. The moment you have 3 children, the children begin to form their own family and their own gang, and you have less work actually as parents. So if you only have 2, the children can imagine that you are the only point of reference. With 3, they begin among, after that, 4 or 5, things get easier. So many reasons for having lots of children. However, I'm aware that most people, especially here in Italy where we live, where people have like 1.5 children maximum. And it's sad because this used to be the country of children. The image I always use is, you watch La Strada of Fellini, you know, it's a very early Fellini movie. It's black and white. It's Anthony Quinn, Giulietta Massina, and it's semi-documentarian. It's this strong man who performs circus tricks in villages, and he's accompanied by this woman, and they perform. And Fellini filmed the actual performances in villages of the 1950s. And you watch that film, the first 20 minutes, and you see children to the horizon. It's filled with children. And when I arrived in Rome as a diplomat and I began driving through Rome with a car, I had this experience where I stopped at a traffic light and I had a pregnant woman crossing the road, and I said, "Oh, wow, there's a pregnant woman." And I said, "That's the first time I've seen a pregnant woman in years." Well, in Hungary or in Germany or Austria or whatever, you see, but here in Italy, you don't have children. You don't have children. And the Italian argument for it is, we cannot afford it. Life is tough. We have to survive. It's too expensive to have children. And in a way, it's true. If you don't have a government that encourages you, that tells you, if you want to have children, we'll have your back. But if you have a government that says, you want to have children, it's your hobby, like a bonsai tree or if you collect cars. It's your thing. A government that says a family with many children is a gift. A family of many children is a basis for a just and good society. If you don't have that, you're on your own. I can understand why people are afraid of the step. And it's not always easy. A friend of mine is, he's a spokesman of Cardinal Schönborn in Vienna. They have 8 children. He says, if I go with all my children to the cinema, we buy tickets and we buy popcorn and Coke for everybody. For that price, my wife and I can have a weekend in some island in the Mediterranean with the flights and a hotel room, you know? So it's a big step to say yes to many children. And many people say, are you crazy? But it's the greatest thing I've ever done in my life.
Well, let's address some of those objections real fast then, because I know that part of in people's minds, and I think this is a genuine concern, they say, well, look, I want to be able to give my children the best. If I have 2 kids, for example, then I can each give them a better quality of life, a better education. What would your response to that be?
My response is, the best you can give to your children is to have many siblings. This is more important than to put them into a very good school. This is more important than anything else. Also because when they grow up, they will always have a strong community. I can see it with my children. They began to go on parties. You always have siblings along. You're never alone. You're never out there. Nothing can blow you over. No passing fad can frighten you because you've got your family. It's like in the Fast and Furious movies, you know, family. No, it's real. It's real. I see my 5th child, a daughter now. She went to her first big ball in Vienna. She had a sibling along. She wasn't alone. She wasn't terrified. And you can cry on the shoulder of your siblings. You do this now via WhatsApp or something, but you always have each other's backs as the greatest gift you can give. Bigger and more important gift than a fantastic education, than good clothes, than a cool phone. It's the best. But if you have many children, you will have to say no to many things. It's reality, except of course if you're really, really rich. But I worked for the church. I was a scriptwriter for a while, so I know how it is that you have to say no. But you win so much. It's so much more. And therefore I encourage everybody, have lots of children. There is a German saying, it's a poem, it says, "Schenkt der Herr ein Häschen, schenkt er auch ein Gräschen," which translated is more or less like, if the Lord gives a little bunny, he will also give the grass to feed it. And I think a bit of it is simply having confidence that God won't drop you if you make that big step. And you have friends, you have other people who have families. So I believe it's countercultural, it's revolutionary, it's reactionary, but it's what makes you happy.
Yeah. One interesting point of that, just kind of picking up on the tail end of that with the support aspect, is that there almost seems to be a cultural inertia in the sense of, here in Italy, what I see is that because less people are having kids becomes harder in the sense of there are less pediatricians, so there are less resources there. There are less people who just have, random baby stuff lying around to help you out when you need something.
Yes.
However, the inverse is also true. When you have friends who are having kids, when you're in a community where that's happening, it's like, oh, there are more pediatricians. Oh, you need a breast pump? Your friend down the street has it. They can lend it to you for a little bit. Like, there's this positive kind of inertia with it, or also negative, but it all kind of depends on the area in which you are.
Two things that I want to say to that. One of them is when I'm grandfather now. My daughter has a daughter, and when she had to fit out her first baby, we had tons of stuff from home that we could give to her. The other thing is, society is not very open to having children. And for instance, Hungary, my government, when you arrive at Budapest airport, there are posters saying Hungary, family-friendly country. This is not just for the foreigners or the tourists coming. This is also for people to know, if you want to go for family and have children, you're not a loser. You are welcome. We will help you to do this. I think that's very helpful.
Yeah. And part of it's just understanding like what is normal or what isn't. So for example, if you're the only person on a flight, for example, with a child, and they start to cry, you might feel out of place and uncomfortable. However, if other people are there with kids too, they just kind of understand this is just, how it goes. This is just part of the normality of it. So you can build that momentum either way.
Where I experienced that very strongly was when I went to the United States and I came to a dinner with conservative Catholic families. And I arrived, and at the dinner I began by saying, I have 6 children. When you say I have 6 children here in Europe, people always say, oh. And when I arrived and I told the first lady that shook my hand, I have 6 children, their expression was like, perhaps God is more generous. She had 9 and the other one had 10.
Poor you, maybe you'll get another one.
Yes, it was like, oh, all right. So well, you see what happens if you get into a corner of society that is open for this, then the thinking is different.
Yeah. So let's just go, one more last thing here is for someone who is raising kids or, intends to do so in the future, those virtues that you mentioned about being cultivated, to what degree, and let's pull from, some really Habsburg-based lesson here, is to what degree do you have to actively teach those virtues versus do they just, acquire them by themselves?
It's a very good question. I would say most of the everyday virtues come by learning, by watching, and by everyday life. Another thing is the things that are important to you. I know that you, Evan, are someone who cares about culture, about art, about literature. You have to be extremely careful as a father not to force this too much on your children. I could talk for hours about European culture, about the Great Books program, about all these things. But if you do that too much, especially at a certain age, your children will not do it. So you have to hold back very strongly, let them discover it on their own. On the other hand, a very nice trick to parents with small children is while they are helpless and lying on the bed and can just roll around a bit, play them your favorite music. Later on, they will think it's their favorite music. They won't know this trick. And that's how you can pass on some things without their resistance. And of course, the same thing goes for faith. My Catholic faith is passed on consciously, but also by children watching you saying your prayers and by children watching how you interact, that you read, for instance. My children have 2 parents who read books avidly. They see that books are important things in your bedroom, on your nightstand. They see you in a free moment having a book. They see you when you drive in a car, you have a book somewhere close by if you stand in a traffic jam. children will catch on that, and they will see, okay, this is something desirable. Even if my parents don't tell me, you have to read, or you read to your children. I read to my children every evening fairy tales, stories, children's books for 25 years. This gets you on the road to read yourself, because if you get read from classics, then your structure, you will be able to appreciate good language. You yourself will have an easier way of writing all of that.
Yeah.
That's not Habsburg stuff, that's common sense.
Well, good. Well, look, I think the concept of passing down those values, and to do so tactfully, as you well pointed out, is a great transition to the next chapter, which would be Catholic and live your faith.
Yes.
So let's talk about this and where you see this obviously replicated in the lives of many Habsburgs, and the faith has been something that's predominant and very important in the life of your family, something that has been passed down. Where do you see the ways in which that gets lived out, the ways in which that does or does not get passed down, and what are the lessons to be learned from that?
A little bit of history. Funnily enough, the first famous Habsburg was our first emperor. He was called Rudolf, and he was emperor in 1273. Our last emperor was Blessed Karl, who was emperor until 1918, until the monarchy ended. Both of them, the tail ends, so to speak, the bookends of our family, both were clearly Catholic. There's a beautiful story about Rudolf before he became emperor. He was a count in Switzerland, not too far away from Limon Lake, Genfersee, and he rode in his forests, and he saw a Catholic priest bringing the Blessed Sacrament, the body of Christ, to a dying man. And he was standing in front of a swollen river, couldn't cross it because the river was swollen. And Rudolf got off his horse, gave the priest his horse, and said, "Please take my horse to bring the sacrament to the dying man," because he knew how important for a dying man to receive the sacraments before you die. And when the priest later that day came back to bring him the horse back, Rudolf said, "Far be it from me that I would ever sit on a horse again that has carried my Lord." So he was clearly, markedly and visibly Catholic, and that didn't keep him from waging war with a bishop if necessary, as a count. That happened sometimes, but he was Catholic. And when he did that, the people in the area said, "Much good will come of this. His family will receive benefits of this grand gesture." And it has, in a way. Some people have a family curse. We have a family blessing from our great first Habsburg emperor until the last. Our last emperor, who for many people is just a footnote of history. Many people don't even know he existed after Franz Joseph. These 1.5, barely 2 years of being an emperor. Blessed Karl, he was a giant in our family because he lived the Catholic faith to the fullest, and he was beatified by a pope. And one day he will be a saint. So we have this very strong encouragement to live our faith. Now, you don't have to be a Catholic to live your faith. You can live your faith, whatever your faith is. But I believe that humans are helplessly transcendent. We're like that. Aristotle already said that. We are built with an eye to transcendence. So living your faith is becoming more human. And the Habsburgs did that. And they did it also in difficult times. In times where being a Catholic wasn't easy as an emperor, because your empire was divided between Catholics and Protestants. In times where being a Catholic meant that you had to be faithful to your wife and stay with her even if she didn't look as beautiful and young as when you got married to her, while other rulers simply got divorced and got married again and again and again and again, like Henry VIII. That wasn't possible if you were a Catholic Habsburg. That had consequences. So the faith really shaped our family. I can say, thank God, the Habsburgs now, they are all Catholic still. Many of them live their faith with great devotion. Most of them pass it on to their children. And it is sort of the backbone of our daily life. In my experience, faith gives you a lot of strength in difficult situations in your life. When I wake up at night and I worry about something, I have a rosary on my nightstand. I have a rosary in my pocket. When I walk, I have one here now. It's a simply plastic rosary, not a beautiful one with pearls, because that trouser might go into the washing machine and it might go with it, and it has to survive that. So what I'm trying to say, a very practical, hands-on, everyday way of Catholic faith. You don't force it down your children's throat. You just live it and they see what you live. If you are in trouble, if you have, a difficult moment in your family, and your children see that the first reaction of the parents is to sit in front of an image of our Lord or a crucifix or cross and say a prayer and ask God's help. This is something they will see. This is not you teaching them. This is them seeing, okay, this is important to my parents. It's like my parents don't watch TV. They watch DVDs sometimes, but they don't watch TV. They rather read a good book. So it's with faith. They say, okay, this is serious to them. They go to Mass, not just on Sundays, but they might also go during the week. Okay, so perhaps this is... My wife told me that. When she was a child, her bedroom was between the bedroom of the parents and the door. Her father always got up every morning very early to go to the early morning Mass. He never forced her to come along. She just heard his steps outside and she knew, okay, this is really important to him. She said, this shaped me for life. And that's why faith is like, the thing, the handle you hold on to when you're in the bus. It is something that becomes a really strong thing that carries you through life. And that's why I encourage every family to live their faith, to pass it on to their children in an everyday life way. Because life will throw you curveballs. Life will throw you into terrible situations. Faith is something that will... Also, it's good for a couple. Man and woman are different. We have different sexes. We have different biographies. We have different ways to experience... I'm saying something very controversial here right now.
We'll let you get away with it.
But that's reality. That's reality. So what you have that unites you is love, is being in love, is attraction. But you are so different. You will come into so many situations where attraction won't pay the bill. Faith will. If you are able to pray together, as Mother Teresa said, family that prays together stays together, you will be able to face even terrible situations. A child dying, a terrible disease. You can face it with faith. And therefore, even from a very egotistical point of view, it's worthwhile. Do it. It helps your relationship, it helps your family, it helps your marriage, it will make your life better.
Well, I think that's a great point. Even for someone who isn't practicing any faith in particular, I think even they could see the value in, let's say, there's a tragedy of sorts, and a child looking to their parent, and instead of the parent's first reaction being to freak out and to despair, for it to instead be, you know what, I'm going to go pray about this, and I'm going to.
Even if you're not very devout, the ritual alone can be helpful, can be very helpful. Being forced and saying, okay, we sit in the corner, we pray. This is something helpful, and it will teach you to get closer to God. It's very easy. Family life helps you to perhaps transform a faith that is perhaps more form into something more lived. Family can be an opportunity to grow in your faith.
Well, you gave so many examples of this, obviously, in this chapter. You even broke it into two parts in the book.
Yes.
And there are a couple examples we can pull from, one of whom is, of course, Maria Theresa, who had 16 children. I mean, her career is just incredible also,
Yes.
empress.
Yes.
And with 16 children, and I believe she even joked about, with some diplomats saying, I would have come to see you if I hadn't been pregnant the whole time, this sort of thing.
But I would like to talk a bit about her because
course.
she's such a great example. And she, if there would ever be a patron saint of multitasking, she would be it. Because, and also a woman, an incredible power woman. Imagine her situation. She's the only heir of her father, Charles VI, the last member of the Habsburg family, the pressure on her to carry on the family, it's a long story, I don't want to talk for hours about it, but she is the heir, she gets married, all the Habsburg Empire is on her shoulders. If she has no children, that's it. That's it with the Habsburg family. That's it with hundreds of years of family history. So she gets married, thank God she begins having children, and then her father dies, and she becomes empress with very little preparation because her father was, and the moment she becomes empress, she sees the army is weak, the finances are terrible, my ministers are old, and she gets immediately attacked by 2, 3, 4, 5 neighboring countries. And she's a woman of 21, more or less. That's it. Her goose is cooked, as they say. It's over with the Habsburgs. And she gets creative. She has incredible energy. And while she, as they say, pops out babies left, right, and center, has one baby every 2 years. She has 16 children in 20 years of marriage.
Wow.
Because she knows that this is the only capital I have, is my family. She dances, she builds up the Habsburg Empire, she builds a network of relations all over Europe. She's incredibly cheerful. She's a very devout woman. It's just incredible. She's such an example. And of course, whenever a baby was being born, the entire Habsburg Empire had to pray. She asked the bells to ring, people to go into the churches and to pray in front of the Blessed Sacrament. This is like a mother to her people. This is like leading by example, passing on the faith, passing on family values by leading by example. People saw, okay, this is what a family is supposed to be. This is what a good Christian life is supposed to be. This is what I also want to be. This is what we would like our political leaders sometimes to be, real examples of devotion, of uprightness, of trying to do the right thing. Maria Theresa was all of that.
That you make a brilliant point at the end. I mean, of course, this is a wonderful woman. The point I really want to pick up on is I was reading this, and based on my understanding of her character, she was someone who did this stuff. Not only was she able to do it, but she was driven to do it because she took really seriously the idea that she was there because God had put her there for the common welfare. That was her purpose, and so she had to live up to that. You know, she couldn't just let things fall apart. She really was driven by this belief. And I started thinking, you know what? People say they don't want politicians who are religious, and I actually think, well, I think we'd all be better off if we had politicians who feared the wrath of God, in a sense, you know, who feared like, I can't do wrong by my people because I'm going to have to answer to that some way. You know, it made me kind of think like, actually, yeah, I'd like them to have a little bit of the fear of the Lord in the sense of, you know, I want them to be kind of held responsible for that.
Absolutely.
To live like that.
We'll speak about that when we speak about the last chapter on dying and on, but I absolutely agree. If somebody is, say, a Calvinist or a devout Jew, I know by which values, by which faith, by which ideas I can hold them accountable. I know what I am confronted with. If somebody has no values, no faith, and nothing, it's more difficult. To a Catholic, I can say, wait a minute, you can't speak up like this because that's not Catholic. But we are used to the idea that all politicians should be neutral. Because if you're neutral, then you are eligible for everybody can vote for you because nobody feels excluded. But I think I prefer a politician that I know, okay, he has this, this, and this value. And he will stick to them, knowing that God one day may ask him, did you live according to that or not? And in my books, this will keep people from being crooks.
Yeah.
Very simply.
Or at the very least, it allows you to call someone else a hypocrite.
Yes.
And you
At
know,
least.
you know, even if someone is moving away from Catholicism of any religion, if they say I'm this politician, these are my beliefs, and then the second they don't live up to that, you can say hypocrite. You can put on the newspapers hypocrite. You can do all this. You know, it actually is beneficial to the populace.
Absolutely.
But you know, kind of moving on from that, while we're on the person of Maria Theresa, I think one really interesting aspect of her life is, of course, she has these 16 children.
Yes.
Now, not all of them grew up having the same faith that she did. And in particular, her son, who took over after her, Joseph II, he starts shutting down monasteries all throughout the empire. Very much, he was a big centralist. He's trying to, changing really the whole network of the empire up to that point. And of course, faith being one of the main elements in that. Now, we know just by observing kind of how things happen is that if you are a faithful Catholic, a faithful Christian, it's not guaranteed that your children grow up like that. No. And what are, the kind of Habsburg life lessons or maxims in terms of dealing with that reality? Understanding to a degree what you can do, and then understanding also, where does it kind of pass the line that, you can't be held responsible, you shouldn't feel bad or beat yourself up over the way that, your children turn out, because I think that's a real struggle people face.
In fact, many people are astonished that some of the children of Mary Theresa, especially Joseph II, was very different in his ideas about faith, and he treated the church really badly for many years. And you wonder how could this happen? So now I have my theory. I pointed out in my book. First of all, his father, while being a very good and nice man and having a very humanistic point of view, he was a Freemason, the only Freemason we ever had in the family, and his faith was rather general, gentle, and friendly. Maria Theresia was, in theory, a very devout Catholic, but she too was under the influence of ideas of enlightenment. So in a way, sometimes, ideas, fads, ideologies around you begin to infiltrate your brain, your thinking, your mind, and you feel you have to put them into reality in your empire. What most people don't realize is that Maria Theresia too began shutting down monasteries, very discreetly, very cautiously, but she did. And so you see, all was not well already with her. I agree with you, you cannot guarantee that your children have the faith. You cannot, because every human being is free. You're free. Nobody gets this face stamped onto him or her forever, and then you're free. You're free. You can sin. We're broken. We have original sin in us. We have a tendency to do these stupid things. That's our heritage. So you cannot guarantee all of your children will follow your values and your faith. But with Maria Theresa, things were complicated. Also, Maria Theresa had a tendency, I gave you the example of leading in a relaxed way into your faith life. She had a very precise way she wrote down timetables for her children, how to do the faith thing every day, even when they were married. And most of her children were terrified of her letters when they arrived. She said, it's the first thing you do when you get out of bed, you kneel down and you say the following 4 prayers. And on the other hand, they had a father who said, come on. Most important thing is we're all nice to each other. Now, if you have those two things, you have this overbearing mother who sort of rams it down your throat, and you have the father who says, which way will you go? So it was the time. It wasn't her fault. And in a way, you can't do everything. But this led to the next and the generation after that to be strongly influenced by the ideas of enlightenment. And then that led to a time of, I would say, over 100 years, where the Catholic faith and devout Catholic faith wasn't something normal for the Habsburg family. It came back then, later on. But I'm saying is, the way you raise your children has consequences for generations.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting case study because, I don't want people who are listening to this to think that because she started to shut down some monasteries, which is true, that negates everything else she did. I mean, she was a genuine woman of faith.
Wonderful.
And it's more so, the more interesting thing is to say, how can someone who is a genuine person of faith start to be influenced and start to do things that kind of go against it or contradict it without even being aware of that? I think that's the more interesting question to ask, and that's an important thing that we can learn from her life about passing down any sort of values. If you're really serious about something, how are some of the discrete ways that you might be undermining it that you're not actually aware of?
Yes.
So that, that's one aspect. I think another degree with it too is looking at, again, what you said, you have the overbearing mother, You also have the father who's very loosey-goosey with it, to use a technical phrase. And when you look at that, it is going back to what we said earlier. You need to introduce people to things, but really let them, to kids to things, but let them kind of step into it on their own, to not ram it down their throats, to not be that overbearing and have everything written out and scripted. So what is the balance, in your own life, what sort of balance have you found with doing that in terms of passing down your values?
I think the great thing about marriage is that there are two. And usually the two people who get married have different characters and have different approaches. So a very good way to get a good balance is to listen to your spouse. My wife, who understands some of my children better than I do, and I sometimes feel I understand others of our children better than she does, sometimes just because you're closer to them, you understand, or sometimes because you're different from that child, it's easier for you to handle that child, and sometimes because you're closer and more similar. So the good thing is you're in two. If you overdo something, your spouse will usually at some point tell you. If you do too little, your spouse will tell you. I give you an example. One of my daughters was rather difficult when she was a small child, and my wife said, I think she wants your presence stronger in her life. I want you to take as a New Year's resolution, try to woo her, try to win her over, try to win her heart, take extra time for her. And I did that. It was incredible. That was my wife telling me, go more. And sometimes she tells me, go less, go less. Don't always try to get them to read the books you like or to watch the movies you like. Goodness gracious. My children now tell me, how could you show us that movie when we were that young? We're still terrified by those two scenes. I was so enthusiastic about, this is a great movie, not thinking of the goodness gracious. It's too much for them. Yeah. My wife always said, are you sure? I said, yes, they can take it. And they tell me now, we're traumatized. So that's why being in two is helpful. Play it by ear, be very cautious, and be strongly aware that each of your children is a different planet. When you have one child, you have a second child. The first child, you think, okay, you're totally overwhelmed by having a child. The second comes along, you think, I know what child is. And then somebody totally different steps into your life. Absolutely totally different from the first one. And the third one comes and you say, goodness, different again. And then you realize you can't prop the same ideas onto them. You can't teach faith the same way to each one of them. Some of them, if you try to encourage them to be too devout, they will totally overdo it themselves. And others are just, as you say, loosey-goosey, and you have to say, come on, get a grip on yourself. You can do a bit more. You can do a bit more. So you learn this by being two and by seeing how different they are. And if you read the letters of Maria Theresia, if you read the letters of Franz Stephan, her husband, about each one of her children, you realize that she really saw the different characters. However, it doesn't mean that she managed to. This morning, before I came here, I read passages about Joseph II's childhood. They basically spoiled him. They spoiled him with the result that he got very sure of whatever I say is true, and he got stubborn. And when he wanted to put his ideas into reality, he didn't look at the reality around him. He just said, if I force my ideas onto my subjects, then they will all be good. And they tried to tell him, don't do that, don't do that. Don't. And he did a lot of terrible things to his monarchy that afterwards his brother Leopold had to try to repair.
That's such a great example because it's literally, you're able to see the development of someone in their youth and then how they turn out and really govern and change an entire empire.
Yes.
And so you see the weight of the way that someone grows up, the impact that can have.
Yes.
And this is, just a plug for studying history in general, is that you actually get to see this. You said this line in the book, I love this. I had actually never heard this before, but history doesn't often repeat itself, but it does often rhyme.
Yes.
And I think that's a great way of looking at this.
Let me talk about that. very often when I look at the problems that we have in the European Union right now, and I see, a country like mine, Hungary, often feels that Brussels does not respect our laws, our rights, our local customs. And I think of history, and I think of a letter that Emperor Charles V in the 16th century wrote to his son Philip II. And it said to him, if you rule over several different countries, you have to respect their languages, their mores, their habits, their rights, their laws, their institutions, or you'll be in devil's kitchen. The European Union could learn from historical precedents. I give you one other example. Joseph II. Joseph II, as I told you, he thought, I know best what is good for my subjects. We don't need 3 crowns in the Habsburg Empire. We don't need the crown of Bohemia, the crown of Hungary, and the crown. We put all the crowns into the treasure collection of the Habsburgs. We have one center, one capital, one crown, and the Hungarians don't need their crown in Hungary. He took the crown away from Hungary. The Hungarians were furious. They didn't feel respected. They said, this is our crown. You are being crowned King of Hungary. You have to respect that. He said, never mind, I'm Emperor of Austria, it's enough. And he took it to Vienna. And the Hungarians were, through all of his reign, they were terrified, they were furious, they were unruly. And they caused trouble, until very few weeks before he died. And Joseph realized, that was wrong. I made a mistake. And he ordered the crown to be brought back to Budapest. And he wrote an epitaph for his tombstone, which was supposed to run, here lies Joseph, who had the best intentions, but everything he did went wrong. He wrote that down. The city of Vienna did not respect it, they didn't use it, but he wrote it down.
Wow.
So in the last months of his life, he realized, I've overdone it. I took my ideas, I tried to force them onto reality instead of looking at reality, learning from the differences in my empire. And his brother Leopold, who became emperor unexpectedly, Joseph died rather unexpectedly, his brother Leopold had to tone down many of the worst excesses of his brother, while he also believed in enlightenment. But all their letters between the two brothers was mostly Joseph trying to criticize his brother for not being enlightened enough, for trying to tell his brother how to raise his children.
Yes.
And the moment he became emperor, Leopold, Pietro Leopoldo, as they call him here in Italy, who was Grand Duke of Tuscany, and led a fantastic, enlightened country. He changed Tuscany into a modern state. He had to tune down, turn back many of the things that Joseph did. And much of it, for instance, Joseph never was crowned King of Hungary because he said, we don't need a Hungarian king. He was called in Hungary the king with a hat because he only wore the hat. Leopold, one of the first gestures was to go to Hungary and let himself be crowned King of Hungary. So he respected the local customs. And the EU could learn from this.
Yes.
Because just running over Hungary or Poland or some other minor Central European country, in the idea of we're all one, we all think alike, it's not how it works.
Well, I think that is a phenomenal transition into point 3, especially with Joseph II, which is believe in empire and in subsidiarity.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this. Empire, first of all, I love this. I think maybe, Americans might need a little bit more of an explanation to get them on board with that. But then let's go ahead and explain subsidiarity as well. So I'll let you take it.
Yes. So to begin with empire, my first idea of empire was, of course, Star Wars. I remember the first time I was in an American cinema and I saw The Empire Strikes Back. When that movie came out, I saw it in an American cinema, huge American cinema. I remember the popcorn and the butter sauce over it. I never had tried that in my life. I was totally blown away. That was my idea of empire, was an evil cackling emperor ruling with terror over a galaxy of uniformed planets where you have stormtroopers everywhere. That was my idea as a child of empire. Then I began reading up on my family history. And I realized that the Habsburg idea of empire is very, 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 very different from that. And that our idea that as America lives of the myth of fighting rulers, tyrants, and empires. We're a democracy, we don't need these things. But I think that sometimes it goes a bit too far. And the idea of the Habsburg idea of empire, the Holy Roman Empire idea for empire, and the basis of the American nation are very similar. You have something built upon a strong respect of the local level. That is what I call subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is the idea that the local level should handle things that the higher level doesn't have to handle, because the local level usually knows better. I, as a family father, know better what's good for my children. I, as a mayor, know best what's good for my town. And so on and so on. Whenever the Habsburg Empire worked well, it respected the local level, the single nations. Whenever it went wrong, it became centralized. It didn't respect the local level. It didn't respect the lower level. And this is the United States have this inside their DNA. America has been built up from the lower level up. America has been built up from the family, from the homestead, from the city, and upwards. State level is already quite high. The federal level at the beginning was supposed to be a rather weak level, keeping everything together, only stepping in situations where the federal level has to step in, but with a strong respect for the local level. This is, if you read Tocqueville, this is what America is. And this is, I think, the vibrant energy that is present in the United States, which, in my humble opinion, America is a point of hope for many people worldwide, because we feel this energy. We're human beings. We're fiercely local. We're not made for saving the entire globe. We're not global. Human beings are local. So the Habsburg Empire, in its best moments, respected this, and America, in its DNA, has this. And whenever a centralistic power thinks that it can tell people everywhere how to handle things, then you should be cautious. You should be careful. Right now, we're in a situation where people are trying to build something like a global state. This is very far away from what we are as humans, and it's very far away from democracy, because we can vote on a local level. We cannot vote on a world level. There's no democratic legitimation. But I'm preaching.
Well, look, I think there's so much to pull from this. This idea of subsidiarity is very key. And like you said, it's at the roots of what you find in the founding of America. It's also at the roots of the Habsburg family. So when the Habsburgs begin reigning, I mean, they're starting with the Holy Roman Empire. So they're starting with about the biggest hodgepodge mix of countries and cultures and regulation, absolutely horrifyingly complicated. They're dealing with this, and so they're having to understand from the very beginning, how do we manage all these interests, and how are we going to handle this? Now, the U.S., of course, is in a very similar position. You have different stakes bargaining, and they're saying, all right, how do we create something where we're able to be a little bit stronger together, but we still reserve what is, ours and what we want to be under our jurisdiction.
Yes.
And I've always said all, political questions in America, they all come down to the question of, to what degree is it states' rights versus it, federal kind of top-down rule over the states. Everything comes back to that.
Yes.
And with this process of subsidiarity, essentially what you're saying is that the things that should be, let's say, the tasks should be handled at the lowest competent level that is able to handle them.
Exactly.
So it doesn't mean that everything has to be handled at a local level. It means the lowest competent level to handle something should be handling that.
Can be handled competently on a local level has to be handled locally.
Exactly.
Only if the local level is overwhelmed, then the higher level should step in. The Habsburgs handled it like that, always. You always respected the local diet. You try to respect the local legislation and all of that. And whenever, to give the example of the European Union, Brussels tries to tell Hungary how to label its bananas. This is the moment, well, perhaps we say paprika in this case because it's Hungarian fruit.
Okay.
Well, what I'm saying is most people know this. it's simply reasonable. It's reasonable, but it has gone lost a bit nowadays, as we live in a time, as I said, where the point of decision goes higher and higher and higher and higher. When we had the COVID crisis, you had the impression that decisions were being taken on world level. This is a global threat, so it has to be decided on a global level. Where is the voter here? Where is the single voter? Do we have the feeling that this is too far away from what we are? I'm just saying the old models, especially the Habsburgs model when it went well in the 19th century and into the 20th century, when the Habsburg Empire was at the best possible. It was complicated. You had to respect every single language. When I spoke with Henry Kissinger last fall, he told me there were 14 different languages in the Austro-Hungarian parliament, but everybody had the right to use their language. It's complicated, but people know that with my identity, I'm respected. What I am is being respected. And it's another point in my book that you have to know what you are and who you are. Whenever the Habsburgs did that, it went well.
Well, I think this is what you illustrate so well, is that, when the Habsburgs respected this principle of subsidiarity, things went well. When they didn't, the Hungarians get up in arms and everyone starts to revolt a little bit against it.
Doesn't mean that the Hungarians always had a right to get up in arms. If you read the introduction to my book by my Prime Minister Orban, he writes a very balanced little meditation on this problem. Because, of course, in 1848, when the Hungarians stood up against Vienna, they had a lot of demands that were right. But if Vienna would have given in to all of the demands, the entire empire would have broken apart. So it's a complicated thing. And of course, then Vienna went into the opposite direction, and Franz Joseph, when he took over, ruled with iron fist for 10 to 15 years in an autocratic way, which had nothing to do with the values for which we stood. And the Hungarians taught him to respect subsidiarity again, and after 1867. So it's waves. It's waves.
It is waves. I think, one of the biggest lessons that I learned from it, and this is what I've seen played out a lot too, because I think one of the biggest reasons for which I'm grateful for my travels is it showed me just how truly diverse places are. And forget about Europe. Let's just take the US, for example. I mean, driving through the desert of New Mexico, you realize, what in the world does a bureaucrat in DC know about New Mexico? And then you go from New Mexico to the Pacific Northwest, completely different world. From there to Florida, absolutely different. From Florida to Minnesota, completely different worlds. And you realize, these places have to have some sovereignty. I mean, this isn't a country, it's a continent.
Yes,
and
it's United States. Don't forget.
With a capital
United
S.
States. Yes,
I like to say.
Yes, states. I have a great respect for that. It was so fun. I set out to write a book about the Habsburgs for an American audience. But while preparing it, right, there is more similarities than you think between those old Holy Roman Empire Habsburg rules and the American DNA. And many American readers tell me, I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
We are closer than we think.
And I think, some of that's been lost because as an American, we refer to ourselves as Americans. Now being abroad, sometimes I'll be a little cheeky and introduce myself as a North Carolinian. Originally that's kind of how it was. Yes. And when you think of an empire, again, maybe in the American imagination,
North Carolina was the first state to secede in 1861, right? Or was it South Carolina?
It was the last state to secede.
The last, so it was South Carolina.
Correct, exactly.
Yeah.
Part of this idea of empire, what we have is that people have in their imagination that's a top-down, I'm going to completely wipe out what you have. But actually, it's not this one world government. It's a supranational organization which has true diversity because it's able to incorporate these different people. And as you mentioned, Gott erhalt, which I believe is the
Gott erhalte.
Okay, yes, it's the national anthem essentially of the empire. It was sung in different languages.
In different languages, absolutely.
And you have these different people able to come and say, look, we are going to participate in something that is greater than ourselves, but we're not going to lose what makes us us.
Exactly. That's it. Absolutely. That's what the Habsburg Empire. So if you are the French Empire, you have the luxury, but also the pitfall of being one nation with one language, you are in a temptation to simply take neighboring countries, to enlarge your empire by war. The Habsburgs from the beginning could never do that because their empire was already so incredibly diverse and complicated that you had to balance out. You had to respect every single one. Oh, you were in trouble. The Holy Roman Emperor had no capital, no diplomats, no money, and no way to enforce his ideas onto all those complicated, powerful local neighbors. It was like diplomacy and chess in 3 levels at the same time. And one thing that helped these kind of alliances were marriages. If I marry my daughter off to the son of my neighboring, the chance that he will wage war against me gets immensely smaller. Immediately it goes away. It's a peaceful way of building alliances and to make peace. And that's why the Habsburgs from the beginning were like that. We were never tempted to be iron-fisted, power-hungry rulers because we couldn't from the beginning.
We would have if we could, but we couldn't.
Well, sometimes you have the temptation. No.
So look, I think one of the most interesting aspects of this subsidiary concept taken to its extreme is actually something I learned recently from another guest I interviewed, Dr. Fernando Cervantes. And he writes about the Spanish legal tradition, which the Habsburgs inherited because it actually originates in medieval Spain before the Spanish branch of the Habsburg happens. But then it's played out in its fullest under the reign of Charles V, of course, a Spanish Habsburg.
Yes.
And what this is, it's the idea of obedezco pero non cumplo. And it means I hear, but I'm not going to implement. And it comes from the Latin understanding of hear, which means that I'm going to listen to you and try to come to an understanding. It doesn't mean simply follow instructions as we believe obedience to be today.
Yes.
So essentially what you have is you have a legal tradition in the Spanish Empire that says if a decision comes down from the top, I have the legal right, as ruler of my jurisdiction, I have the legal right to say, I hear you, obedezco, I obey, but I don't comply, pero non cumplo. And the reason is, you don't understand how things are on the ground. So if you send me an order from Madrid, I can hear it, I can say, obedezco, pero non cumplo. Yes. And I can send that back and say, Your Majesty, this is actually something that if you were to be here on the ground, you would see things different ways. Here are the reasons, okay? And, I'm doing this because it's in your interest. If I were to do differently, it actually hurt the entire empire. And they're able to do this. They had this legal structure that allowed the subsidiarities to do that. And of course, once it goes and they have this conversation, then the emperor can say, look, I've heard and I understand, your concerns, but we're still going to do this. But the fact that there was even this mechanism in place for someone to flat out refuse and not do it for 3 years.
Leopold II wrote to either to Bohemia or to Hungary. He wrote a letter and says, I'm your emperor, but if I infringe on your local rights, I promise you the right to take up arms against me. That's an echo of what you just said. This all comes from the time of Spain, of Charles V, of the respect for the legal, the rights and the legal systems in spot. Yes, very interesting.
And then just one more anecdote, because I found this fun. Philip II, all right, he was overseeing a letter that had to be sent from Lisbon to Barcelona. And the letter says, all right, this is being sent from Lisbon to Barcelona. And he says, no, you can't do that. And to show just how much he respects the subsidiarity, he says, no, you have to say this is going from Lisbon to the outskirts, to the borders of the Portuguese Empire, or the Portuguese kingdom, and then it's going from there to the borders of the Castilian kingdom, and then it's going from there to Aragon.
That is beautiful.
And he shows this because he's saying, I want to respect everyone in what they're doing. It isn't just going from Lisbon to Barcelona, it's going through these 3 kingdoms.
One of the ways that the Habsburgs showed their respect for every single nation within their empire was that at least the crown prince had to learn all the languages. And Otto Habsburg, son of Charles, whom I still knew, spoke about 12 languages, all the languages of the empire. And Zita shocked people when the last empress, Zita, in the First World War, She shocked people by being able to speak to them in their language when she went to the hospitals to look after the wounded soldiers. So it's one way of respecting is that you learn the language of your subject, even the ones you don't like that much. You learn the language as a sign of respect. I think it's wonderful. I think it's so much we can learn from that.
Yeah. Well, there's this saying, if you want to speak to a man's head in terms of complimenting him intellectually, you speak to him in a foreign language in which you can reply. If you want to speak to his heart, you speak to him in his language.
Yes.
I think there's a lot to be learned from that as well. But let's move on from this, topic of empire subsidiarity.
Yes.
Next rule, know who you are.
Ah. Yes.
So, for knowing who you are, you begin this with a beautiful line, essentially saying that we are all swept into the future. I love this image. Every day we are swept into the future. But the one thing that keeps you anchored is knowing who you are.
Yes.
So, highlight a little bit some examples of these from the lives of the Habsburgs.
Well, first of all, talking about our time, we live in a time where our technocratical rulers are trying to convince us that we are only truly free if we are something different every day. And you can be a man today and a woman tomorrow and a man after tomorrow, and that's great, that's wonderful, that's brilliant. And you can have blue hair today and a beard tomorrow and after tomorrow. It's like the idea you're only truly free if you change all the time. And I would say you're truly free if you become what you are and know what you are. If you know your roots, if you know your traditions. Habsburgs were always fiercely traditional people. They translated the traditions of the family into the time, and that may mean doing something very differently. But first of all, they knew where they came from. Now, Otto Habsburg, son of the last emperor, whom I still knew and who was a living legend for all of us and a great example, he had a saying in German. I'm going to say it in German first and I will translate it. It's like, wer nicht weiß, woher kommt, weiß nicht, wohin geht, weil nicht weiß, wo steht. And he said it in exactly that sound, which is, who doesn't know where he comes from, he doesn't know where he's going because he doesn't know where he stands. So you need to know your roots. You need to know where you come from. You need to know what your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents stood for. What makes a Habsburg? What does it mean to be a Habsburg today? And in fact, my book is something of that. When I sat down to write a book about the 7 rules for turbulent times, as I called it, I made a list. I said, what exactly do we stand for? What are we? What does it mean for me? Did I try to live like that? And there is no bucket list of what it is to be a Habsburg. There is no bucket list of what our core principles are and our traditions are. I could ask Otto. I could ask the head of our family, Charles now. I can ask a few uncles, say, what makes a Habsburg? What do we stand for? They would come with family, faith, but then you would go on, what else? And that's how I got up with the list. So you find out what your family and your traditions have. You can then say, I don't want that. You can say, I want to start something new. That's okay. But like a painter, you have to learn how to paint a finger and how to paint a human being before you go and begin to do abstract painting. As yourself, you have to find out, where do I come from? What did my father stand for? What was my grandfather's values? And you have to try to learn these things. I believe that it will help you to get anchored. Knowing your traditions will protect you from the changing fads of every day, will make you more of a human being, and will make you more interesting. If you stand for things, then you're interesting. If you don't stand for anything, but you try to be in the middle of the road, as much as somebody once said, if you stand in the middle of the road, you get run over by a truck. If you try to be middle of the road and don't have any strong positions, you get swept away. You get swept away by every fad that passes. You have to follow, as Cardinal Ratzinger once said of a theologian, you run after every single train until there's no more train to run after. And you don't want to be like that. You want to be a man if you're a man.
Yeah, well, I think this rule in particular resonates a lot with me because it's obviously with Rewire the West, what I'm trying to do is help people understand, their kind of cultural inheritance, understanding what are the works that have shaped your entire outlook on life, maybe that you're not even aware of, and what are the ones that you aren't aware of that you can go back to learn from, to tap into this deep wealth of knowledge, of beauty. And I think there's so much of that. But on a personal level, and this is where I wouldn't want people to get discouraged. Let's say that you don't come from a family that's been around for nearly a millennium, you know, and you're like, I don't even know who my great-great-grandfather was. Well, even the absence, and in that way, even the absence of a tradition can help you recognize what you have to establish going forwards.
Yes.
You know, this is so encouraging. It's like, know who you are. And even if you come from bad roots, you can be, you know, the hero in the movie and start to understand, all right, look, this is where we came from, but we're going to change things around. And you see this in the lives of the Habsburgs.
Yes.
I mean, even, you know, you see, I love you, you mentioned this so well on many occasions. You know, for one example, you have Joseph II kind of going crazy with his sectionalist reforms, and then Leopold comes along and he's like, all right, let's rein in some of that. But you also have with particular rulers who are, you know, they've very much abandoned the faith, for example. You actually have different cousins and brothers getting together and like, all right, well, he's doing that, but we're actually going to do this. And so you have this degree to which the family is kind of correcting itself,
Yes.
you know, in feeling about, all right, how do we proceed? And what I like about this is because, you know, a lot of people, again, who don't have as rich a family history as you do, or it's not immediately obvious, they might say, well, all right, like where I come from is boring. And you can say, no, like you come from this, you get to be the stone that completely changes the future of your family. That's super encouraging.
Evan, this is wonderful that you say that, because in fact there is a chapter in my book where the Habsburgs started out really cool. They nearly immediately got an emperor in the 13th century, and after that there was no follow-up. They dropped into a hole and disappeared for about 150 years from the great power play of the emperors. They weren't electors, they weren't elected, they sat in Austria, and they had nothing to do. So what they did in that time is they built a tradition for themselves. First of all, they began to draw endless family trees with descendants, how they descend from Noah, how they descend from the Roman emperors, how they descend, all that. They discovered documents that made them something special. Now, I'm not trying to say you can invent a family history for yourself, you shouldn't. But as you said correctly, most of us are not Habsburgs. What you should do is you can see what are the things that inspire me. What are the things that inspire me to greatness? Is it my faith? Is it my love for art? Is it my love for movies? Is it my love for books? Is it ideals? Is it politics? What are the things? These are the values that you want to pass on. You can start your own dynasty. You can begin by saying, this is the set of values that my dynasty, the Amato dynasty, will be. I will pass this on to my children. And you really do pass on your values because your grandchildren will still carry a bit of what you have inside you. So that's why I want you to take a good and hard look. Say, what am I? What really makes me tick? What inspires me? And some of it may be really what my parents told me. Some of it is something I acquired myself. And this mix can be the basis, of course, together with what your spouse believes in and what your spouse brings to the table. This can be the basis of a new set of virtues that you will pass on through generations. So that's why I believe, know who you are and don't try to be something else than what you are. Sometimes you can reinvent yourself, but it's quite useful. If you're a man, you're a man. You can decide to be a woman, but you're a man. And if you come from a family that stood strong in tradition, you can go crazy and have blue hair and stand against everything of that. But it's probably closer to what you are that you lean into that. And you know, tradition is something good. It's something that helps us to live our lives, to stand when the wind blows. And therefore, I strongly encourage people to figure these things out, think about them. And one way of doing it is to follow someone like you, to think about what are the works of art, what is the culture, what is the history that shaped us as Europeans, as Americans.
Yeah, look, I think to go back to an earlier point of the conversation when we discussed almost the mythologizing of the Habsburgs, that part of that takes place in this time, and I think to a degree, it really is a healthy thing. Like, you need something to kind of spur you on to live up to. You have to set a bar high enough for yourself to live up to it. This is why I would encourage it. It might sound silly, but like, you know, if you don't have a coat of arms, I mean, I don't know many Americans who have family coats of arms, but make one. Like, make something that has a set of values that you want to live by, that's hanging up in your house, you know, something that you can follow, that you say, this is us, you know, and this is what we want to be for generations. And you aspire to live to that.
There is a whole community of people on Twitter that are incredible Tolkien fans. One of them is called Tea with Tolkien. She has a fantastic Twitter account. I follow her. Many people are inspired by the Lord of the Rings novels because they are inspiring you to be better, to work on yourself, to be there for the others. They're incredibly encouraging. I don't want to say that everybody has to read the Lord of the Rings and build their lives on it, but even literature can inspire you to be greater, and you can pass that on.
Well, we were even talking about Star Wars before this interview, and part of the Habsburgs in that 150-year period where they're just kind of hanging out, and you're like, what are they doing? It almost feels like they're Luke on Dagobah training in the swamp.
Yes.
You know, they're going to build something up. They're going to be the Jedi who saves the day, but for right now, they're in the swamp. And I think, again, to bring this down to a very practical level for people who are listening to this, who are like, look, my family doesn't have anything. My dad was an alcoholic, you know, my parents were divorced, whatever. It's like, all right, maybe you're just starting your journey in the swamp. You know, you didn't have the glamour before, you know, you're starting in the swamp. But if you can see it like that, you're like, all right, well, I'm not destined to live here. I'm doing the hard work, I'm doing the training. My story begins here, but we're going somewhere else.
You have to find your Yoda and you have to find your Force. And, you know, this may be different for everybody.
Yeah.
But this is a very good image. I like it.
Well, thank you. So, look, I've technically skipped over one chapter, which I believe is Stand for Law and Justice.
Yes.
And this was after the subsidiarity one.
Yes.
Now, let's discuss this, okay? Because I think, you know, as one is building a dynasty for their family, they have to stand up for those under them. And this is a big point of what you have in this chapter. So can you tell me a little bit about this rule?
I think this chapter is mostly in to correct the idea of emperors that we have and of rulers that we have. I make a case for monarchy in there. I'm trying to say, look, guys, your idea of monarchy from the movies of evil rulers suppressing people and being tyrants, which is it's very useful to have an evil guy in a movie who is like that, is often not what reality looked like. And take Europe. Some of the best countries in Europe are monarchies, even today. They're constitutional monarchies, but they are monarchies. And if you look at people like William and Kate, if you look at people like Charles, like the Queen in England, but also like princes and kings in other countries, they really serve their countries. They don't have privacy. We imagine sometimes, oh, they live in a castle. Oh, they have privilege. Oh, they have drivers. Oh, they have police protection. Oh, they're rich. Oh, they wear nice clothes. But it comes with a terrible price. And the terrible price is you give up your private life. You are public all the time. But why do you do this? Because, and this is the difference to today's politicians, I was in a privileged position to get to know many of the current kings and queens in Europe when they were kings and queens in training. And I talked with them and I listened to them. And what they do is they learn from the first moment of their life, you are not there for yourself. Your life is service to your country. Whatever you do, whatever you say, wherever you go, what you do can never divide your country. You like a football team and you're a great fan of that football team, you won't cheer publicly for it because the people of all the other football teams will be unhappy about it. You swallow it down. You have to be balanced. You have to be there for everyone. Your decisions have consequences for yourself, for your children, for your grandchildren. This is the frame of mind that you are being raised into. For instance, I got to know the current king of Belgium, Philippe. When Philippe grew up, he was carefully trained not to speak French or Flemish too much, one of the two, because his country is divided between two languages. Respect both sides. Not to show your preference for the Catholic faith too much, because there are other faiths in your country. This is very extreme, But you see that if you are raised like that, you're strongly encouraged to serve your people, be very strongly obedient to the laws, never break laws, don't be a crook. You can't be a crook if you're a king. You might have been able to be that hundreds of years ago. You can't anymore nowadays. And what I'm trying to say is, yes, kings are not elected. Yes, the son of a king or a daughter of a king will inherit and become the next king without the people having a say in it, which goes against our days of democracy. But there is a lot of advantages too. As a king or a queen, you don't have to look, if I say this, will this get me re-elected in 1.5 years' time? I should say something that gets me re-elected, even if it's not the best for my country. The king can say, I can withstand a storm if I say something that's not popular, because I believe, from knowing what my father did and my grandfather did, and knowing that my son will have to live with my decisions, I can live through the storm and say, no, this is what we'll do. Even if it's not popular, even if the media attack me for it, this is what I believe is right. And I'm just saying, democracy, as somebody once said, is perhaps the worst of forms, but it's the only one that basically works nowadays. Democracy is very fragile. It can be easily hijacked, broken, and turned into despotism. Monarchy, not that easily. And that's why in that chapter, I try to show how Habsburgs over the centuries try to serve their people. And I believe they did. I think most of them were really good emperors with their personal failures and weaknesses, but they really tried to be good emperors. You read that chapter, you will see many examples of how they strongly tried to be there for their people up until the last emperor, Blessed Charles. It's interesting that our last emperor, who was, as I said, a minor footnote in Habsburg history, who ruled for 1.5 years, who managed to lose a war, lose the empire, his throne, and went into exile and died in exile. This is the ultimate loser if you look at history. But he was one of the greatest we had because he lived to his deathbed, literally to his deathbed, that whatever he did for his people, even when they had thrown him out and said, we don't want you anymore, he offered up his suffering in his last illness and his deathbed for the peoples of his empire. This is really what I would like to see in some of our political leaders nowadays. We would wish to have leaders like that. That's why I think the Habsburgs and this book is popular, especially in the United States, because people feel there is something in these leaders that I would like our leaders to be.
Yeah, well, look, every time I try to explain an idea like monarchism to my fellow Americans, when I talk to them, obviously the first thing they say is, well, they're not elected, as if that's the kind of trump card to turn the table. And I say, actually, that is the greatest strength. The fact that they're not out there vying for re-election allows them to embrace a way of dealing with the world that's very different from the way our politicians handle things. And correct me on this quote. I believe it was Franz Joseph when he met with one of the American presidents who said, when he was asked, well, really, what's the point of your job? And he said, my role is to protect my people from our politicians. Essentially, yes. is something that's above them. And I think that's when you look at someone like Queen Elizabeth and her reign, I mean, the sheer amount of just tons of prime ministers under her. And of course, the country developing in different ways, but she provides a sense of stability for a nation, for a commonwealth.
Yes.
For something that's far passing beyond her borders. She is able to provide something like that, which brings me then to a second point, because you do see this really much so in Elizabeth's life, is that the price of privilege is duty. And you said this too, if you have a favorite football team, you can't root for them over another. But I don't think people understand the extent to which this truly is the price of privilege. It's duty. You cease to exist. You now exist as the monarch.
Yes.
The monarch is a different thing. It's an institution. It's the crown. It's not you, a person.
I'd like to say two things to it. First of all, to your argument before, he's not elected. Hitler was elected by a large majority.
There you go.
Second, when it was known that Prince Charles had cancer, and that was a first for many decades that something of that kind was known of a monarch. The first reaction of Tom Holland, who is a historian, on Twitter was, "Poor guy," immediately public, because there was a statement by the palace. Mm-hmm. And I thought, that's the point. You don't belong to yourself. You belong to the public. They have a right to know how you are. And the reaction of the palace was, he had his operation. They found out he had a cancer. It was immediately published. People have a right to know. And that shows that you don't have a private life. It's like when you become Pope, you don't belong to yourself anymore. You belong to the United World Church. And the same goes for a ruler. Yes, some of the rulers sometimes seem to have privilege. I know that a few of the princes, before they became kings, lived a cool lifestyle and sometimes go to parties and things like that. So you could think, oh, that would be cool to be. You don't know how it is to get into that seat, onto the Iron Throne, as they would say in the Game of Thrones.
Well, look, I think the best criticisms of monarchy are when people see that the people who have this privilege are not living up to their duty.
Yes.
When they say, you're supposed to be different from us. All right, you have all these things, but the price of that, again, is duty. You're supposed to be different from us. So what are you doing when you're going out doing stupid stuff at parties?
Yes.
When you're just getting divorced like everyone else?
Yes.
Like that is, in my mind, an absolutely legitimate, a very good critique. And because you start to see, well, that people are saying, you're no different than me. You just have more money. But the point is, monarchy is best played out and it gives it the respect it deserves because people want someone that's different from them. They want someone who stays married, who stays, this one pillar of peace, this pillar of stability in their life.
Yes.
That in the cost of doing that is enormous to the person who undergoes it. But that is when it's most lived out, is when you have individuals who do that.
Yes.
Queen Elizabeth, Blessed Karl.
The good thing about monarchy is that it even is useful, even if the monarch is not very good, very talented, very brilliant, or very extraordinary. The system somehow trundles along, but there will be another monarch, like there will be another pope after each pope. And it is a very, very strong basis of stability. And of course, ideally, you would have a selfless, holy, deeply devout monarch living as an example, but that was not always the case in our family either. And the system and the family will carry on.
And this is a great point as well, which a lot of people miss nowadays because we're so used to seeing the figurehead being the individual. But when you're able to see the figurehead as the institution, this is, an Englishman said this to me, and they basically, I'll make it a little bit more PG, but they basically said, all right, you get an idiot on the throne. You can say, long live the king. He's a moron, but long live the king. Because what you're saying is like, you're not supporting that individual per se, you're supporting the institution that provides a supranational framework in which you're incorporated with others.
Yes.
Hey there, so I hope you are enjoying this interview so far. I just wanted to take a minute to butt in and tell you about a really cool buddy of mine. His name is Dave. And just so you know, by the way, I'm not being paid to say this. This is actually someone I really admire and appreciate. And so I want to tell you about some of the cool work that he's doing. So anyways, in addition to being an incredible visual artist and musician, my pal Dave is also a very, very talented leather worker. And he runs this company called OréMoose, or OréMoose, if you get the play on words there. And anyways, he makes top-notch, really, really, really quality leather products, everything from Bible covers to wallets to satchels to rosary pouches, you name it. Now, I genuinely love the work that Dave is doing, and that is why, for example, I'm teaming up with him on a couple upcoming projects of my own. You'll hear more about those if you are on my email list. But in the meantime, Dave has also been kind and offered to support my work by looping me in to the affiliate program at OréMoose. So if you are in the market for a premium quality, completely customizable leather Bible cover, rosary pouch, satchel wallet, whatever it might be, then by all means definitely go and check out Dave's work at OréMoose.com. That is OREMOOSE, like the animal.com, and use the code REWIRETHEWEST to let him know that I sent you. Not only will you get a top-notch leather product that is built to last literally hundreds of years, but you will also get 15% off your order and support my work in the process. It is a win for you, a win for me, and a win for my pal Dave. So use the link in the description, check out his work, and if you buy something, it will go a long way in supporting the creation of more videos like these. So check out that link, it's in the description, use the code REWIRETHEWEST, and as always, thank you for watching. Let's get back to the video. All right, so we've just had, a great conversation up to this point covering the first 5 rules in the Habsburg Way. Now, rule number 6, be brave in battle. Let's talk about this one. I know I said this is the one I'll leave kind of, up to you to pick a couple big moments in history that you think are important, that this sense of being brave, and this is where warfare, just, my own personal aside here, I think it resonates so much with the human experience, because when it comes to taking risks, when it comes to being bold, you don't get this anywhere else more so than when life and death is on the line. Yes. So we can learn from battles, we can learn from wars in terms of our own life. When, okay, we have to figure out, are we gonna, take this job or that one? It might not feel like we're going up to, slay an enemy, an opponent. We're not going to mortal combat, but we get to learn from the bravery, from the, moments that we see in these people's lives. So let's talk about this chapter, Be Brave in Battle. What are some of the standout moments from you?
Oh, one of the things that we have to realize is that at least up to a certain point, part of the job of a king, an emperor, or a prince was that sometimes diplomacy didn't work. You had to don your armor, step on a horse, go out there, face a battle with sweat and blood and tears, and sometimes getting cut off a limb of yours and dying. This is something that politicians don't do anymore nowadays.
If I can interject too, that's just a good life lesson. I mean, sometimes things do happen.
Exactly.
As much as we try to avoid it,
Exactly.
sometimes it does come to blows.
I don't say in my book that everybody has to be a soldier and go on the battlefield, but we have many little battlefields and many situations where it takes courage to stand up for something, and then sometimes you get into life and death situations, and sometimes you get into situations where you have to be very courageous and where you're a fool in everybody's eyes, but you stand for values. So the Habsburgs sometimes had to duke it out on the battlefield with sword in hand, especially in the first centuries, and sometimes it perhaps wasn't wise to do so. Franz Joseph, for instance, had the humility of learning in one of the great battles of Solferino that he wasn't that great tactician and general, and because of his probably weaknesses, a terrible, terrible fiasco of a battle happened. And others were very gifted to be leaders on the battlefield. I could name many, many great examples. I think for me, my personal hero, of course, is Archduke Charles. He was never emperor. He was Archduke. He was one of the many, many brilliant brothers of Emperor Franz II.
The great generation.
Yes, what I call the glorious generation of the Habsburgs. And he was the one brother who was really gifted as a soldier and as a general and as a field marshal, and he was during the Napoleonic Wars. Imagine him having lived 100 years before or later, he wouldn't have been that interesting, but he happened to be one of the family members during the Napoleonic Wars. So the emperor gave him the task to reform the army, to train them, after having thrown away one memo after the other of his, when he ever said, my brother, we have to reform the army. And he said, at some point they were so desperate, he said, okay, try to show me what you can do.
At this point in history, the Austrians had lost enough of the coalition wars for him to actually listen to his brother on this.
And finally he could do. And he reformed the army according to the newest things he had seen in the battle with the French. He had learned from the way Napoleon acted. Yeah. And he managed to get the team for one really good match. And that one match was the Battle of Aspern. And he was the first man to beat Napoleon in a land battle. Nowadays we say, come on, he lost a lot of times later on. But at that point, when he confronted Napoleon in the fields beside Vienna, Napoleon had never been beaten. So he had the aura of being absolutely unbeatable. And Archduke Charles, with his army, managed this incredible feat to beat Napoleon. And it went like thunder through all of Europe. They said, oh, he can be beaten. And how did he did it? And there was one moment in that battle, which was a Julius Caesar moment, I think. You know, Julius Caesar was famous for the moments when everybody fled, when the battle changed and suddenly everybody began to flee from the first row. He took the signs, the signa, he put them over his shoulder and he marched through the fleeing people towards the enemy. And the people around him began to see that. And then they followed the sigma. And in a few situations, Caesar turned around the battle. And there was a moment in that battle, which was a bloody, terrible battle, the Battle of Aspern. And it took more or less 1.5 days of terrible fighting and many, many deaths. There was a moment where Archduke Charles showed that he was not only a general leading from behind, but from the center. And there was a moment when the battle was changing, the French troops were breaking through, and he got onto his house, he grabbed the standard of the Habsburg army, and he rode with a white, shining horse in the middle of the battle, very well visible for every enemy, and he led his troops again, and with that he saved the day. And so he was very courageous in battle, and that scene is on the Heldenplatz in Vienna, is the statue of Charles with a flag doing that. I once want to see a really good movie about the Battle of Aspern.
Yeah.
Now critics usually say, come on, Aspern, Schmaspern. He lost 2 weeks later in the Battle of Wagram, and then he had to step down from his task. Yeah, but Aspern changed everything because Europe saw that Napoleon could be beaten.
Yeah. Well, it's a watershed moment for many reasons. You know, number one, for what you just said, but also from Archduke Charles on a personal level. I mean, this is the moment of the battle where the Austrian line has broken,
yes,
which in the French forces are pushing through,
yes,
which is essentially like it's game over at that point. Yes. And he, in the heat of that moment, instead of fleeing, you know, instead of
yes,
what some people would even say was an imprudent decision, because they would say, no, at that point you have to fall
general
into a retreat.
You don't risk the general's
Exactly.
life.
You don't risk the general's life. You're imprudent because you're doing something that's brash, and you should, you know, fall into a retreat to save the men. He said, no, right now we're going to turn this around as we can. And I think the timing of it, there's a lot to learn from this, because you have to execute that move in such a precise moment. It can't have gone on too far. He has to make that decision really fast.
Yes.
And that's where it shows his character, because he decides, the line's broken, I'm going to do this, get me the standard, we're going in. And then to see how that can change the momentum of a battle, there's something to be learned in there about being able to make a fast decision like that, and to really throw yourself into the
and be
heat of it.
courageous. Be courageous, and sometimes you have to stand against everybody, and you will be laughed at perhaps, but sometimes you have to do these things. I know all of us know these moments, and perhaps these moments will still come in your life, and I think be courageous is a good lesson. It's a good lesson for us, and yes, courage in battle, or have a good general.
Or have a good general.
For instance, the moment that Europe was most threatened by Islam in 1683, when in 1683 the Osmanic armies were in the heart of Europe at the gates of Vienna, and Leopold I, who was emperor then, he wasn't a great general. He wasn't a soldier, really. He wanted to become a priest before he became emperor. And then his brother died and he had to become emperor. So his gifts were more diplomatic. The Turks announced that they were going to attack Europe, but then they had to get their army together, and it gave him a window of 3 months. He got the Polish king to be on his side. Jan Sobieski, who was a hero, a brilliant fighter, a brilliant soldier, one of the greatest soldiers ever lived. He got him on his side. He convinced the Poles, if the Ottomans attack you, we will come to your help. If they attack us, you will come. And then they decided on Vienna. They made the siege of Vienna, and it was Jan Sobieski who broke through the lines, who saved the day, and who saved Vienna. In this case, the emperor knew that he was no soldier. So he had Jan Sobieski, a great soldier, fighting for him, but he made the important diplomatic move to get him on his side, and that saved Vienna. So not everybody is made out to be a soldier, but you can be a hero in many ways.
Well, there are so many learning lessons to be pulled from this chapter in particular. A lot of when I'm reading it, I'm thinking, okay, Archduke Charles. Again, the Austrians have lost several wars of the coalition at this point. He's saying we have to learn from the French. We have to learn what they're doing. We have to follow Napoleon's squares. We have, learn about how do we modernize our army. And so he's able to learn from the mistakes and do things differently. Franz Joseph loses the Battle of Solferino, a disgrace. This is a really bad battle. He realizes, I'm not cut out from this. I need a good general. Again, a learning lesson right there. Even Leopold, he's able to have self-knowledge to say, I'm not the man for the job, but you know what I am going to do? I'm going to do this. Look, it's not required that the emperor go to battle, but I am going to show up. I am going to put my dog in this fight, really, but I know that I need to get other people on my team. So what are the moves that I have to make that happen? It's like if I'm looking out for my subjects, I might have to go above and beyond my comfort zone. I might have to get outside and realize, all right, I don't typically do this, but hey, Jan, you want to, sign a deal? This sort of thing. And it's just this creativity when you're in a rut. Again, Archduke Charles, looking at it from the Austrian perspective, it's like, all right, this is our situation. How are we going to turn things around?
Yes.
And it's this niftiness. Even, in the heat of the battle, this is where you see it most exemplified, of course, is when he realizes this is breaking, we have to do something about it, and you rush in. So many learning lessons in there of like how to judge the situation, how to react.
And also, sometimes you get into situations you don't want. Emperor Charles, our last emperor, he was a gentle, friendly, warm-hearted, smiling, soft-spoken man. He wasn't cut out to be a soldier and a hero in battle. He was in all the trenches, he was in all the battlefields of the First World War before he became emperor. He saw war everywhere, and in the battle in the Alps, he showed great bravery. He saved one life in a very dangerous situation, and when it was necessary, he could also be a good soldier. And so you don't know what's in you until you get tested, but the readiness to say, okay, I will be ready for courageous things, even if I don't believe I have that in me. I think you can learn that also from the Habsburgs.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sometimes war comes to your door, whether you want it or not, and you have to understand there are times you have to stand up, and turning tail is a worse outcome than actually facing this thing and losing.
Yes.
So I think that's a great point to leave that. Let's move on to the last chapter, which is dying well. Now, you started this talking about the knocking ritual, and there's so much to be pulled from this. I remember I saw it in high school, was deeply moved about it. It's come up in my mind dozens of times, and it was so, ever since that moment, and it was so nice to read about it and have it explained from your perspective. Of course, you've been fortunate enough to attend, but we'll get to that. First, though, with dying well, even the concept of dying well and what it means to die well, I think we have to elucidate that a little bit. So can you share in your chapter from the lives of the Habsburgs, what does it look like to die well, and how might that compare and contrast with our current modern understanding of what a good death looks like?
So why do I want to learn how to die well from the Habsburgs? I've never died, and we're all amateurs at that. Mm-hmm. So we look at how other people did it, and the Habsburgs were always very much aware of their impending death. They knew, especially as rulers, that, and because they believed in God, that they would have to render accountability for what they did. They knew as Catholics that their death decided about where they were going to spend eternal life. They believed that they could either go to heaven or to hell. They knew that what they did in their life as emperor had an importance for that. God would not judge them like he would judge the farmer, because he says, in your hands was responsibility over millions of people, and you made their lives miserable by your egotism. You will be very hardly judged for that. The Habsburgs knew that. So all of their lives, they prepared for the moment of their death. They wanted to make sure that they met death with the sacraments. They wanted to make sure that their death was exemplary for all the subjects to show how a good Christian dies. And they wanted to make sure that the funeral was a sermon, was a lesson for everybody to say, I want that too. I want to die like that. I want to be buried like that. And wow. And this is something that goes through the centuries. One example is Emperor Maximilian in the 16th century. He had I could talk for hours about him. He is the last knight. He's a flamboyant character, and who sort of, as you said before, imagine your life to be a movie. Mm-hmm. He imagined his life to be a knightly adventure film.
Yes.
And then he tried to be a knight when
he wrote 3 biographies.
Yes, and they were all like pimped up versions of his life. and he made knightly jostling tournaments at a time when there were no knights anymore. Mm. So his death was supposed to be a grand gesture, but it wasn't just grand. It was a lesson to his subjects. And he made 3 written testamentary requests for his death. One was that after his death, his body should be shorn, his teeth broken out, and his body should be flagellated, whipped, and in that state being shown to the people. As a sign, I'm a poor, dirty sinner and nothing else. I'm just like you. Second, and he had that painted and sent everywhere in the empire. There is several copies of that painting. I've stood in front of one of them. The second one was that he had his coat of arms, his favorite armor, beautiful armor, put in kneeling position with folded hands in front of a Blessed Sacrament in a church, and said, let it kneel there for all eternity to teach people devotion. And I've been to the church in Innsbruck where it is. It's still kneeling. You can go there, it's in the wall. So he says, look, be devout, even your armor should be devout. It's flamboyant, it's big, but it's beautiful. And the third one was that he asked not to have a huge funeral monument, but to be buried in the steps under the altar. And I've been there for the first time last year, 2 years ago. It's a church. You walk down into the church, you came to the steps leading up to the high altar, and on the second step, there's just the word Maximilian, nothing else. His body, his coffin is being pushed into that. He says, I want my body to be under the main altar, so the priest stands above my heart when he says Mass, prays for me. So you see, he teaches people, be humble, be nothing special. The most important thing is the sacrifice of the Mass. This is 3 testamentary gestures that he asked for, which were grand, flamboyant, but also for his subjects to learn. And that went through the centuries. So when you talk about the knocking ritual, which is the great ritual of the funeral of a Habsburg, they build on a long tradition, of facing death and of making your funeral an example. So the knocking ritual is, I've experienced it twice. Now you will say you never lived in a monarchy, and that's true. But I was present when the last Habsburg Empress died, Zita. I was a young boy, but I was present when she was carried to her last resting place in the Kapuzinergruft, the crypt of the Capuchins in Vienna. And I experienced the knocking ritual from close up. It's a beautiful, probably very old tradition. So when the master of ceremonies comes to the door that leads down to the crypt, and he 3 times bangs at the door, and the voice of the Capuchin monk inside answers him. It says, who is there? And he says, Zita, Empress of Austria, Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia, Queen of Croatia, Princess of and all the titles, about 1 minute of titles. And the voice answers, we don't know her. and the next thing that they read out all the accomplishments of the emperor, what he did, all the wars he waged, all the territories he gained, the marriages he had, all of that. And the voice again says, we don't know her.
Which, by the way, that list goes on for a while.
For a while.
It really does.
If you read out the list of all the titles and then you read it long, and then they knock again, and then he says, who is there? And he says, Zita, a poor mortal woman and a sinner. And the door opens. What does it show? An emperor in the end is a poor sinner in front of God who will be judged. And every one of you here and all of you listening and watching this, it's the same for you. It's incredibly strong. And it's a difference to the one of the Queen of England. When we all watched the funeral of the Queen of England, and when her coffin disappeared in the floor and they read out her titles, there was nothing of that poor sinner. It was just the titles.
Yes.
So I thought, well, the Habsburgs had a good one. And this expresses something for each one of us. The moment you die is an important moment. We live in a time where people get the illusion that they will live forever. And death is banned into hospitals. You don't see death. You never experience death in your normal life. In the past, you experienced death all the time. You were always at the deathbed of your ancestors because they died in the house. And nowadays, of course, somewhere else, you're often not there. And you don't even see the dead body. So you don't have this experience of something having left this body. And the Habsburgs were very aware of that. And they wanted their death to be a moment where they went prepared in front of God. All their life was preparation for death. Every prayer they did was preparation for death. And if you do it like this, then you have a good chance of meeting death prepared. And I would want this to be on the minds of many people. One example still, what I want to tell, I don't know whether I've written it in my book, but Saint Christopher, you know, the giant in the legend that carried Christ over a river. Saint Christopher was a very popular patron saint in the 16th century. And he was the patron of a good death. A good death was a death where you could prepare. Nowadays, when you ask people in interviews, how would you want to die? Most people say, in my sleep, after a great party or something like that, without noticing. That would have been the contrary of a good death for my ancestors. The ideal answer would have been, I want to know when I'll die so that I can prepare for it. I want to die knowingly and preparing with the sacraments of the church. That is a good death. And it would be horrible if I would die in my sleep. I want to know when I die. I want to know. That's why, in a way, it's enviable to be Marie Antoinette or Louis XVI, knowing that I will have my execution in 2 weeks' time. Because you know when you will die, you can prepare, you can pray, and you can go there with open eyes and say to God, I'm coming now, I give back my soul. I think all of us should wish for that. We don't know this. You don't know how your death will come to you. You don't know whether it's the airplane that will drop tomorrow when I fly back home. You don't know whether you will have Parkinson or anything that takes your mind away. You don't know that. But you can prepare for your death by praying for it and by giving it to God and saying, the way it comes, I will take it. So that's all the meaning behind that chapter.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest changes is, as you said, today people want death to be innocuous, to want it to be instantaneous, but in reality, to actually be able to process the fact that you are dying is a privilege. You know, it's something that people used to pray to Saint Christopher to allow them to have these moments of getting able to go through that. But so much of our world now, it sterilizes death, and it doesn't just do that. It kind of says it doesn't exist. Like, forget the fact that you're going to die. And so because we're so unaccustomed to death, when a loved one passes, we don't even know really how to process it. Or, I think even worse, try to bypass the process of grief, which is you go to a funeral and they say, this is what I hear all the time, this person would have wanted for us to be happy. They wouldn't have wanted you to be sad. They would have wanted you to be happy. So we're going to, cheer and kind of sing songs and, kumbaya, that sort of thing. When in reality, no, grief it's a painful emotion, but it's not a bad emotion. And it's something that deserves to be processed. And I think this came out kind of between the lines of this last chapter, because you didn't touch so much on grief, but
No.
being able to actually process loss and process decay and death. I mean, what is death? That's a loss of life.
Yes.
And so to be able to process that is something that we need to do for ourselves, but other people need to do
Yes.
as well. And so it's almost reframing the concept of death. Now, real quick, I do want to touch on this one line, beautiful line by Emperor Karl. It resonates with you in a way that few other lines do. But when he's there on his deathbed, dying this painful death, and his advisors are there and they're trying to get his son Otto out of the room, he says, no, call him in. Let him see how an emperor dies. And that phrase sticks with you.
It sticks with you even more when Otto talked to me about when that moment happened, because I of course knew Otto, and he told me that it was incredibly hard for him to be there, but he understood afterwards why his father had done it. But he was crying because he knew his father was dying. His father wanted him to be there because he knew he couldn't know that the empire in no way would come back. But as I say, know who you are. Otto was the heir. He had to know that also this is part of what you are. So he told me it was very hard for him. He remembers every moment of it, seeing his father die, but he totally understood why his father did it. So yeah, it's shocking. I sometimes, my mother told me how my grandmother died. All her daughters were around her, and they prayed with her and they sang with her. Her death was more easy. It was easier, but they wanted to be there. And I think we should all want to be there when our parents die, if it's possible for us. It helps them. It helps us. It's part of life, and for many people, we have found a way through mobiles and through entertainment to fill our days with noise and entertainment, and to keep us from being able to be really sad, being able to feel grief, because we can cover it with lots of entertainment. It's important to face death. It's important to face grief. It's important, as I think Paul says this, St. Paul, weep with the weeping and laugh with the laughing. We must be able to sustain and therefore face the topic of death. That's, I think, one of the main takeaways from the last chapter.
Yeah, and you said it was Otto who had said, if you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you're
Yes.
going. I think he probably would have agreed just as much with the statement, if you don't know where you're going, if you
Yes,
don't know what that end
exactly.
is, that's going to influence how you live right now.
Quid agis prudenter agas et respice finem. Whatever you do, do it in a wise way and always keep the end in view. This would be a summary in Latin of what a wise man, but also what the Habsburgs try to do.
Well, you end the book with that phrase, and I think it's brilliant, because really by keeping the end in mind, it frames all of our accomplishments.
Yes.
It helps us, it simultaneously spurs you on to action because you want to accomplish something. But also in the knocking ritual, it reminds you that regardless of what you accomplish, you are a poor man and a sinner. At the end of the day, they knock on the door, so-and-so, ruler of this, ruler of that, accomplisher of all these deeds. We don't know you. Poor
Yes.
man and a sinner. And that's
Yes.
what it is. And that's,
Yes.
so it's this dichotomy of, at the same time, it spurs you on to action because you want to leave something behind, again, for your family. You have a family that's passed down generation after generation. You want to pass things on to them, but then also realizing, hey, your accomplishments only matter so much.
Yes, and as we all know, the cemetery is full of indispensable people. I'm only dust.
That's a great line. I love that.
Yes, we're only dust. We're in dust. We'll go. What remains is our soul. Our soul is eternal, and our accomplishments go away. It's like that.
Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'll simply ask to conclude it. If someone were to read your book and to not take any other lesson away but one, what would you want that one lesson to be?
I would say, think and try to know what you are and become that person. I think that's the summary of it all. Really know where you come from, know where you're going. then you will know where you are. I think that's the line that keeps it all together. So know your roots, know where you come from, know your values, shape your life around that, and then you will not go wrong. You will stand when the wind blows. I think that's the lesson.
Thank you. This has been wonderful having you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful conversation.